Have you ever looked out into the darkness and felt something staring back at you? In the quiet village of Ravenshollow, the darkness hides a secret so twisted, it blurs the line between reality and nightmare. A simple scarecrow, once meant to protect the crops, has become something far more sinister. Meet Ethan Rowley, a historian with a passion for uncovering the village's forgotten past, but this time, his curiosity might cost him more than he ever imagined. Lately, the villagers have been whispering about strange things happening at night. Shadows moving in the fields, the sound of footsteps when no one's there, and the scarecrow. It's never in the same place twice. But no one speaks of it openly, for fear of what might happen if they do. Ethan's fascination with the scarecrow began as an innocent inquiry into village folklore, but as the days pass, the boundary between myth and reality starts to crumble. He's about to discover that some legends are not meant to be unearthed. There's something deeply wrong with the scarecrow. Its presence is unnatural, as though it's more than just straw and wood. And when the sun sets, the village falls into a suffocating silence, as if the very air is afraid to move. What starts as a mystery soon spirals into a waking nightmare. Will Ethan unravel the truth before it's too late, or will he become the next victim of Ravenshallow's darkest secret? Before we delve into the terrifying mystery that awaits, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. You won't want to miss what comes next, because in Ravenshollow, the scarecrow is just the beginning. It was a night like any other, or so Ethan thought. The sky above Ravenshollow was unusually dark, with clouds blotting out the moon, casting the village in an unsettling shadow. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Ethan had been drawn to the fields, a compulsion he couldn't explain. The scarecrow stood at its usual post, but something about it felt different tonight. It wasn't just the way it loomed over the crops, like a sentinel watching over the village. No, it was the way its head seemed to tilt ever so slightly, as if following Ethan's every move. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off. After all, it was just a scarecrow, or so he tried to convince himself. As Ethan walked through the damp soil, the crunch of his boots seemed deafening against the unnatural silence of the night. The familiar smells of wet earth and decaying crops clung to the air, but underneath, there was something else, something metallic, like the faint scent of blood. He stopped in his tracks, straining to listen. That's when he heard it, the faintest rustling of straw. His heart pounded in his chest, a wave of cold fear washing over him. The scarecrow hadn't moved, or had it? Ethan's eyes flicked back to it, the silhouette now shrouded in the mist that crept through the fields. It was standing exactly where it always had, but was it facing him now? The wind picked up suddenly, a harsh, biting gust that tore through the fields, sending the stalks of corn swaying violently. The scarecrow's tattered clothes flapped in the wind, and for a brief moment, Ethan could have sworn it was alive. Its arms twitched, its straw-filled chest heaving as if it were breathing. The sensation was so real, so visceral, that Ethan took a step back, his heart thundering in his ears. The scarecrow's hollow, stitched eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto him, and the weight of its gaze made his skin crawl. Ethan's breath quickened, the feeling of dread creeping up his spine like cold fingers. Something was horribly wrong. Unable to shake the feeling, Ethan forced himself to move. His footsteps hurried now. The path back to the village seemed longer than usual, the fog thickening around him, muffling every sound except the eerie rustling of the scarecrow behind him. He didn't dare turn around. Not yet. But with every step he took, the fear gnawed at him. What if it was following him? What if, in the moment he wasn't looking, the scarecrow had left its post? The once familiar fields now felt like a maze of darkness and shadows, each corner hiding something sinister, waiting to reveal itself. Ethan's mind raced, every rational thought slipping away as the terror mounted. As the nights went on, Ethan's unease grew, but so did his obsession. He couldn't let go of the feeling that something was terribly wrong in Ravenshollow. The scarecrow wasn't just an ordinary figure meant to scare off birds. There was something malevolent about it, something that felt ancient and hungry. Every night, It seemed to inch closer to the village. At first, the changes were subtle. One night, its head was tilted a different way. The next, its arms seemed raised slightly, almost as if it was reaching for something or someone. Ethan knew the villagers had noticed too, though none of them dared to speak of it. Windows were shut tight at sundown, doors bolted with trembling hands. The fear was palpable. The whispers began. Some said they heard footsteps in the fields long after dark, heavy and deliberate. Others swore they saw movement just beyond the reach of their lanterns, a figure stalking through the cornfields. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there, just the Scarecrow, standing perfectly still in the distance. Ethan, too, began hearing things. At night, in the quiet of his home, he heard faint scratching sounds at the window, like straw brushing against the glass. And then there were the voices, low, barely audible murmurs, calling his name, urging him to return to the fields. It was as though the Scarecrow wanted him to come back. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Ethan ventured out into the fields once more. The sun had barely set, yet the air was already thick with the promise of something sinister. As he approached the Scarecrow, the air grew colder, unnaturally so, as though he had stepped into another world entirely. The fields around him were eerily quiet, too quiet. Not a single insect chirped, no wind stirred the crops. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse echoing in his ears. He stopped a few feet away from the Scarecrow, its shadow stretching long and distorted in the fading light. And then it happened. A sound, soft at first, like straw brushing against the ground. But it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the Scarecrow. It was coming from the ground beneath it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the earth shifted slightly, the dirt trembling as if something was moving below. Panic gripped him, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. Slowly, the Scarecrow's head turned, its stitched mouth curling into what could only be described as a grotesque smile. The ground trembled again, and this time, Ethan heard it clearly, a groaning sound, like something trying to claw its way to the surface. Suddenly, the Scarecrow jerked forward, its wooden frame creaking unnervingly. It took a step, just one, but that was enough to send Ethan stumbling backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing was alive. There was no denying it now. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but as he turned to flee, he realized he was not alone. Shadows moved in the corner of his vision, figures, twisted and warped, lurking just beyond the field. They were watching him, waiting. The Scarecrow wasn't the only thing haunting Ravenshollow. Ethan bolted, but as he ran, the weight of the unseen eyes followed, and with each step, the sense of impending doom grew heavier. The nightmare had only just begun. The next night, the terror truly began. Ethan couldn't shake the images from the field, the Scarecrow's twisted smile, and the shadows moving at the edge of his vision. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what he had seen, but deep down, he knew there was no explanation that could soothe his fear. That night, sleep came to him in fitful waves, his dreams plagued by the same haunting scene. The Scarecrow, its hollow eyes fixed on him, moving closer with each breath. But this time, in the dream, it didn't stop at the edge of the field. It crossed into the village, its straw feet scraping against the ground, leaving a trail of blackened earth in its wake. In the dream, Ethan found himself standing alone in the village square. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally, as if alive. He could hear the sound of rustling straw, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. His heart pounded as the familiar figure of the Scarecrow emerged from the darkness, its body swaying with each unnatural step. But something was different. Its once limp, ragged arms now moved with purpose, and the faint glint of something sharp reflected in moonlight. The thing was armed. As it drew closer, Ethan realized with horror that the Scarecrow's hands were no longer straw. They were bone, with long, skeletal fingers clutching a sickle stained with rust and old blood. Panic surged through Ethan, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the Scarecrow approached. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, and with every breath, the scent of rot and decay filled his lungs. The Scarecrow's stitched mouth began to open, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. From its hollow chest came a low, guttural whisper, his name, over and over, like a chant carried on the wind. Ethan's heart raced, his skin crawling with terror, but the world around him seemed to blur, as if reality itself was unraveling. The Scarecrow raised its sickle, the blade gleaming in the dim light, and Ethan could feel the weight of its intent. This wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. Just as the sickle came down, Ethan jolted awake, his body drenched in cold sweat. His room was dark, but something was wrong. The oppressive feeling from the dream lingered, as if it had followed him into the waking world. His breath caught in his throat as he glanced towards a window, and there, standing in the shadows just outside, was the silhouette of the Scarecrow. It was real, its figure unmistakable against the moonlit sky. It hadn't just invaded his dreams. It was here. His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. But before he could react, the Scarecrow turned and slowly began walking away, its body swaying with that same unnatural motion. Shaken, Ethan scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The Scarecrow disappeared into the misty fields, but the sight of it lingering so close to his home sent a wave of dread washing over him. And then he noticed something else. On the windowsill, where nothing should have been, lay a single piece of straw. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked it up, the rough texture of it sending a shiver down his spine. This was no longer just a nightmare. The Scarecrow had crossed over into his reality, and it wasn't going to stop. The line between his dreams and the waking world had blurred, and now he wasn't sure where the nightmare ended and his life began. The next morning, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of dread clinging to him. Every step he took, every sound he heard, felt distorted, as though the world around him had shifted, twisted in some subtle yet horrifying way. He stood at his window, staring out into the fields where the Scarecrow had vanished just hours before. The piece of straw he had found still sat on his desk, a reminder that what had happened was not just a figment of his imagination. There was something deeply wrong in Ravenshollow, and Ethan knew he had to get to the bottom of it. But as he began to investigate, the unease only grew. His research took him deep into the village's forgotten history, poring over ancient texts and long-neglected records in the dusty archives. That's when he found it, the connection. Ravenshollow had a dark past, one that had been buried beneath layers of time and forgotten stories. Centuries ago, the village had been plagued by a series of mysterious deaths. The victims had all been found in the fields, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, as if they had been mangled by something not entirely human. The local folklore had blamed a curse tied to a figure known only as the Watcher of the Fields, a being that protected the village but demanded a dark price in return. The Scarecrow. It wasn't just a simple farm tool. It was part of an ancient ritual, a safeguard placed by the village's ancestors to keep something far worse at bay. But something had gone terribly wrong. As Ethan dug deeper, he discovered that the ritual had been broken. The Scarecrow, meant to protect, had become corrupted, twisted by whatever force it had once kept imprisoned. Now, instead of guarding the village, it had become a vessel for an ancient evil that had long been forgotten. And worse yet, it was growing stronger. Every time it moved, every night it wandered closer to the village, it was feeding on the fear of the people, gathering strength for something far more terrifying. As Ethan connected the dots, he realized the terrifying truth. The Scarecrow wasn't acting alone. It was merely the harbinger, the first sign of something larger lurking beneath the surface. Ravenshollow itself was sitting on a long-buried secret, a power that had been dormant for centuries but was now stirring once more. The Scarecrow's movements were a signal, a warning that something far worse was coming. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Ethan's mind, and with each revelation, the terror grew. He wasn't just facing a haunted scarecrow. He was up against something much darker, something ancient and hungry, waiting for its moment to rise. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of dread pressing down on him. His dreams were no longer just dreams. They were glimpses into a reality that was slowly unraveling. The scarecrow wasn't just a harbinger of death. It was a messenger, sent to warn him of what was coming. The villagers had lived in ignorance, believing the scarecrow was simply a relic of old superstitions. But now they were all in grave danger. The fields weren't just haunted by a restless spirit. They were the resting place of something much worse, and Ethan was the only one who knew the truth. The scarecrow was just the beginning. Something far more sinister was awakening, and it was coming for them all. Determined to stop it, Ethan began to piece together the final steps of the ancient ritual, hoping that somehow he could reverse the damage that had been done. But as he worked, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the scarecrow was never meant to protect them at all? What if it had always been a conduit, a way to keep the darkness fed? And now that it had tasted fear, it was only a matter of time before it fully awakened. The clock was ticking, and Ethan knew he had little time before the nightmare that had plagued his dreams became a reality. As the reality of the situation sank in, Ethan knew he was running out of time. The scarecrow wasn't just some haunted figure stalking the fields. It was a gateway to something far worse, something that had been lying dormant beneath the soil for centuries. With each passing night, the scarecrow grew bolder, moving closer to the village, feeding off the fear that now gripped every resident. The tension in Ravenshollow was palpable, and Ethan could see it in the villagers' eyes. They knew something was wrong, but none dared to speak it aloud. And Ethan, now burdened with the terrible truth, felt the crushing weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to stop it, whatever it was, before it was too late. Ethan's desperation led him to the one person in the village who might hold the key to unlocking the scarecrow's curse. An old woman who lived in isolation on the outskirts of Ravenshollow, a woman rumored to have knowledge of the village's darkest secrets. Her home was a decrepit cottage, hidden among the twisted trees of the forest. The villagers called her a witch, but Ethan knew she was his last hope. When he knocked on her door, it creaked open on its own, as if the house itself was expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and smoke, and the dim light of flickering candles cast eerie shadows across the walls. The woman sat in the corner, her eyes milky and blind, but she spoke as though she had been watching Ethan all along. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Her voice rasped, dry as dead leaves. Ethan nodded, the fear tightening in his chest. The scarecrow. It's moving. It's not just straw anymore. The old woman smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "You don't understand, boy. The scarecrow is only a puppet. What you're dealing with is far older, far darker than you can imagine. The land beneath this village is cursed. It always has been. And the scarecrow, it's just the beginning." Ethan's heart pounded as the woman explained the true nature of the curse. The scarecrow was bound to the land, not as a guardian, but as a gatekeeper. Beneath the fields of Ravenshollow lay an ancient evil, a force that had been sealed away long ago by the ancestors of the village. The scarecrow was created as a warning, a symbol to keep the darkness at bay. But over the centuries, the ritual that kept the evil contained had weakened, and now the scarecrow itself had become corrupted, possessed by the very thing it was meant to guard against. The old woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's feeding. The fear of the villagers, the terror in your heart, it's what gives it power. And when it's strong enough, it will break free." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The weight of her words sank in, and he realized the terrifying truth. Every night, as the scarecrow moved closer, it was one step nearer to releasing whatever lurked beneath the fields. The villagers were already in danger, but if the entity fully awoke, it wouldn't stop at Ravenshollow. It would consume everything. Ethan had little time left. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's milky eyes met his, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of fear in her expression. "You can't stop it," she said, "but you can delay it. Destroy the Scarecrow. Burn it to ash. It's the only way to buy yourself time." Armed with the knowledge of what he had to do, Ethan left the cottage, the cold night air biting at his skin. The village was quiet, too quiet, and the sense of dread weighed heavily on him. He knew what was coming. The Scarecrow had to be destroyed, but even as he prepared for the final confrontation, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the old woman was right. This wasn't the end. It was only a delay, a temporary reprieve. The true evil beneath the fields was stirring, and no matter what he did, it was only a matter of time before it broke free. His journey into the darkness was just beginning, and the nightmare was far from over. The night of the final confrontation arrived with a sense of impending doom, thick as the mist that rolled in from the fields. Ethan stood at the edge of the village, staring into the darkness where the Scarecrow lurked, its form barely visible through the fog. His hands trembled as he gripped the torch tightly, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced unnervingly across the ground. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, the oppressive presence of something much darker than the Scarecrow itself. This was it, the moment he had dreaded, yet could no longer avoid. He had to destroy the Scarecrow, but deep down, Ethan knew it wasn't just about burning straw and cloth. He was about to face the embodiment of the curse that had plagued Ravenshollow for centuries. As Ethan stepped into the fields, the silence was deafening. No wind, no rustling crops, only the heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to wrap around him like a noose. Each step he took was deliberate, the sound of his boots crunching on the soil, the only noise in the vast expanse of emptiness. And then he saw it, the Scarecrow, standing at the far end of the field, its arms outstretched as if welcoming him. Its once ragged clothes now hung unnaturally still, the figure more human than ever before. Ethan's heart raced, his blood pounding in his ears. He could feel the malevolent force emanating from the Scarecrow, stronger than it had ever been. The thing was waiting for him. With every step closer, Ethan felt the air grow colder, the torch in his hand flickering as though the very darkness around him was trying to snuff it out. The Scarecrow's eyes, those hollow stitched holes, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and its smile, that grotesque, twisted smile, was wider now, almost mocking. Ethan's pulse quickened as the ground beneath him began to tremble, a faint rumble that grew stronger the closer he got. The earth itself seemed to be alive, responding to the Scarecrow's presence. It wasn't just standing there. It was feeding off the land, drawing power from something buried deep beneath the fields. Ethan knew he was out of time. In a single, swift motion, Ethan raised the torch, ready to set the Scarecrow ablaze. But before he could act, the ground beneath him erupted. With a violent crack, the soil split open, and from the depths below, something began to rise. The Scarecrow moved, its wooden frame creaking as it stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement at a time. Ethan stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest as a massive figure emerged from the ground. Twisted roots and blackened earth clung to its form, a monstrous entity, ancient and horrifying, its eyes burning with a deep, malevolent light. The Scarecrow had been nothing more than a vessel, a shell for the real terror that now stood before him. The entity let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the air, rattling Ethan to his core. It towered over him, its form barely visible in the darkness, but the sheer presence of it was overwhelming. Ethan's mind raced. This was what the old woman had warned him about. The Scarecrow was merely a puppet, a pawn in a much larger game. The real threat had been lying dormant beneath the fields, waiting for its moment to emerge. And now, it had. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the entity's massive form loomed closer, its eyes locked onto him with a hunger that sent a wave of cold terror through his veins. He realized with chilling clarity that there was no stopping this. Desperation clawed at him, but he knew he had no choice. Ethan threw the torch at the Scarecrow, the flames engulfing its body in an instant. The dry straw and tattered clothes ignited quickly, the fire roaring to life. But the entity did not retreat. Instead, it let out a deafening roar, the ground beneath Ethan shaking violently. The Scarecrow's body crumbled into ash, but the creature only grew stronger, its form solidifying as it fed on the fear radiating from Ethan. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Burning the Scarecrow had done nothing. The real evil had already been unleashed. And now, it was free. In the final moments, Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing with the impossible choice before him. He could run, try to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before his eyes. But what good would it do? The entity would destroy Ravenshollow, and then it would spread, consuming everything in its path. Or he could stay and fight, knowing full well that he stood no chance against something so ancient, so powerful. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, crushing his will. And as the entity took one final step toward him, Ethan made his choice. He wasn't going to run. He couldn't. Not anymore. The scene faded into darkness as Ethan stood his ground, the flames of the Scarecrow's ashes flickering weakly in the background. The roar of the entity echoed through the night, but Ethan's resolve held firm. This was not the end. Not yet. The fires from the burning Scarecrow flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the field, but the darkness seemed to grow thicker, almost swallowing the flames. The monstrous entity stood before Ethan, its twisted form barely visible, but its presence undeniable. The air around him felt suffocating, thick with a sense of dread that gnawed at his sanity. He had made his choice to stay, but now, faced with the true embodiment of the curse that had haunted Ravenshollow for centuries, the weight of that decision pressed down on him like a vice. The entity let out another deep, bone-chilling growl, its massive figure looming over him like a living nightmare. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet, as if the very earth was reacting to the presence of the ancient evil. Time seemed to slow, every heartbeat thundering in Ethan's ears. The entity did not strike, nor did it retreat. It simply watched him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, filled with an unsettling intelligence. It was as though it was waiting for something, or perhaps for Ethan to make a move. The realization hit him like ice in his veins. This creature wasn't just a mindless force of destruction. It was sentient, calculating, and it knew more than it let on. A terrifying thought crept into his mind. What if this was only the beginning? What if the entity had been toying with him, letting him believe he had a chance, only to reveal that there was no stopping it? As the wind howled through the empty fields, Ethan felt a new wave of fear wash over him. He had destroyed the Scarecrow, but nothing had changed. The entity was still there, more powerful than ever, and the curse that had been bound to Ravenshollow was unraveling. Ethan had hoped that burning the Scarecrow would end the nightmare, but now he realized the horrifying truth. The Scarecrow was never the real threat. It had always been a distraction, a decoy to hide the true nature of the evil that lay beneath the land. The Scarecrow had been destroyed, but the ancient force it guarded had been awakened. The ground beneath Ravenshollow was alive with malevolent energy, and there was no telling what might come next. Ethan's thoughts raced, his mind filled with unanswered questions. Why had the Scarecrow been created in the first place? What dark ritual had bound this creature to the land, and why had it been allowed to fester for so long? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what will happen now that the entity was free? The village had been living in ignorance for centuries, but that ignorance had been shattered. The entity was no longer bound by the Scarecrow's curse, and Ethan could feel its hunger, its desire to consume everything in its path. He could already see the twisted roots creeping through the fields, black and gnarled, spreading like a disease. Ravenshollow was in grave danger, and time was running out. As the night deepened, Ethan knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed answers, but the old woman who had guided him was gone, her cottage reduced to ash in the wake of the Scarecrow's destruction. The villagers wouldn't believe him. They had already dismissed the growing horror as superstition. But Ethan couldn't ignore the truth. The entity was just beginning its reign of terror, And it wouldn't stop with Ravenshollow. What lay beneath the earth was far worse than he had imagined, a force that had been waiting for centuries to rise again. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a reality that would soon consume them all.